For something completely different.
Just to mark the extent of the difference, I grew up in Bangor, the original Bangor, not our North Wales colony. And when I took great interest in doing a little bit of local history, I'm particularly fascinated by the first ever census in which in Ireland was in the 1840s. The parish of Bangor had at that stage 10,000 Presbyterians, 500 Anglicans, nobody else. Now, when I was growing up, it was much more diverse. I can't give you the figures for people, but for churches, there were 6 Presbyterian churches, 2 Anglican, 2 Methodist, 1 Baptist, and 1 Catholic. Right. So it was still overwhelmingly a Presbyterian town, right? And while Roman Catholic was the largest denomination in Northern Ireland, Presbyterians were the largest Protestant denomination and provided the motor behind unionism as a whole. Although, of course, before Gladstone made his frightful mistake over Ireland, most Presbyterians inclined to the Liberal Party rather than the Conservative Party. But Gladstone soon learned them of that in that respect. I then want to move forward to the Government of Ireland Act 1920, which is thought of mainly as the one that established the Stormont Parliament. In fact, it was the 4th Irish Home Rule Bill. And it's actually fascinating to read the Irish Home Rule Bills as they evolved, because they were tackling with issues which now people are talking about in terms of the English problem, in terms of the devolution and all the rest of it. Go and look at how they tackled that issue in the Home Rule Bills, because the solutions varied from one bill to another. The detailed provisions of the bill varied from one to another. The very first Home Rule Bill didn't have any particular safeguards for minority interests with regard to the operation of Home Rule, but by the time you reach the 4th Home Rule Bill, the 1921, there is a very elaborate set of provisions dealing with this. And it's obvious that the draftsman of that bill had before him the US Constitution and the various amendments passed to that, because some of the provisions to limit the power of the Parliament that was going to be established are copied literally from the American precedents. And it's very interesting on the question of churches. Now, there was a clear prohibition in the Northern Ireland Act, the Government of Ireland Act, against any form of religious discrimination, whether for or against. But it uses the language of the US Constitution by repeating the phrase about shall not endow any religion. Now, it's really quite interesting to look at that. That phrase in the US Constitution led to the complete separation of church and state. It was carefully respected in Northern Ireland. The same provision was then carried through the 1921 Irish Free State Agreement Act into the Constitution of the Irish Free State. And in De Valera's Constitution, you can still find that phrase tucked away at the back where nobody will ever find it. But did that lead to a separation of church and state in the Republic of Ireland? No. There was a very, 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 very close relationship. The Irish government of those days simply handed over education, welfare, hospitals, a whole host of things to the church for the church to run. Now, I say for those interested in constitutional law, you might like to sort of contrast the same phrase, the same words, 3 different contexts, 3 totally different results. Right? One of the great nationalist grievances was with regard to Stormont, which they alleged to discriminate, etc., etc. But we had that provision in the 1920 Act against any discriminatory legislation. And while it had never been tested in court, the general view, which I share, was that that prohibition also applied to the exercise of power. So it's not just legislation, it's also governmental decisions. And in the 50 years that governed the Parliament of Northern Ireland and the government of Northern Ireland, there was only one case in which someone went to the courts to challenge a provision as being discriminatory. It was an Anglican clergyman who brought the action, complaining about the provisions, this is in the 1930s, the provisions by the Stormont government to fund Catholic schools. And he was describing that as being claimed that was unconstitutional. You'll be glad to know that the claim failed. One other little historical we'll go off with a slight tangent. Balfour, very wise man who actually understood Ireland quite well, he took the view in 1920, when it was pretty well clear that the Government of Ireland Act was not going to be effective with regard to the 26 counties, and that they were on a trajectory which took them out of the United Kingdom quite soon thereafter. He was quite very clear in the view that in that case it would not be wise, he thought, to apply the Government of Ireland Act to Northern Ireland, that he thought the idea of having a separate parliament and government was a bad idea, and that one should just simply continue to govern that area in exactly the same way as it was beforehand. And the reason why he took that view is that he thought that sectarian feelings and passions were so strong that it was inevitable that there would be either discrimination or the perception of discrimination, and the issue would be fought about. But unfortunately, Balfour's views were not followed. It would be interesting to see what history would have been had they been. Now, I have to put in another comment, which really I had intended to put in at the very beginning. And I'll just put this as a series of propositions. I haven't time to justify them, but believe me, they're correct. Thank you. The position in Northern Ireland should not be regarded as a religious conflict. The issue is not religion. They're not fighting over religion. It's not over justification by faith alone or the role of a tradition in the formation of theology and all the rest of it. Religion is a badge of identity. National identity is formed within a religious matrix, and so religion is now the best possible indicator about national identity and political allegiance that there is. The issue is best looked at in terms of a national conflict over the question of to which state shall this territory belong, and then the associated socio-economic arguments about disadvantage and discrimination that flow from that. But these are not, it's not religion per se, and if you look at it in terms of religion, you'll find bits of it baffling, but if you look at it as a national conflict, as I said, it all falls into place. But it also has to be said, there is, because of the religious element, background as it were, there's a very strong communal basis to social life and political life. But the social basis, the communal basis of social life is just as strong as the communal basis of politics. And that's something to bear in mind with regard to this. Insofar, we don't have issues of church or state in the nature that the other contributors here have mentioned. But there is one very fraught relationship between church and state, and that is the relationship between the state, whether it is the pre-1972 Northern Ireland government, or the actions of direct rule administrators afterwards, or indeed days at the moment, and that's the relationship between the state and the Catholic Church. The largest single one, the one that is in its sense representative of the minority, and which there was an interesting relationship in the Stormont days. While there was no overt closeness, and nothing got as strong as collusion as such, but yet there was a clear sort of understanding that took place. I mentioned provisions starting in 1930 to fund Catholic education. Now, there were complaints by Catholics that these provisions weren't as generous as they would like them to be, but at every stage these provisions were more generous than anything happening in any other part of the United Kingdom. And in my days growing up, we were in a situation where 100% of the running costs and 95% of the capital costs of Catholic schools were borne by the state, but the schools were owned by the church and run by the church without the state having anything but a very marginal interest in it. So those provisions were fairly generous. You could see the same sort of generosity or understanding over the creation of the Department of Scholastic Philosophy at Queen's University Belfast, so as to enable the Catholic bishops to firmly endorse that university and support it. The way in which the law of charities and the administration of it, which again was something laying very close to the interests of the church, that the state regulation of charities was minimal compared to the rest of the United Kingdom. No charity commissioners. Only a very small charities department in the Ministry of Finance, and a very, very close. And to get a really nice interplay of this, there was one of a predecessors at the Faculty of Law at Queen's University, was chairing a committee looking into charity law in Northern Ireland, and to read the passage where evidence was taken from the leader of the Catholic Church in Northern Ireland over the issue of charity law, where there are some areas where Catholics have a very particular interest. I'm not going to go into it. It's quite academic, fascinating, but would take far too long. But the conversation that was then taking place between the Archbishop and the member of the commission, who was then Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, and during the war had been Minister for Public Security in the government, over whether it would be advisable to have the changes the Church wanted made to charity law or not. It just shows a very close understanding where Lord McDermott, who was the LCJ, was assuring the Archbishop not to worry about this issue. We can't legislate with it because it will cause problems in London, but leave it to the judges. We'll sort that out. And they did, 20 years later, they did sort it out quite well. So there was an interesting relationship there. For the moment, I don't know that there is much that can be said in particular. The issues that my colleagues have been talking about don't arise in institutional terms. Obviously, people have their own views, which are fairly widespread. I noticed that when it came to devolution, it's interesting how things are handled. They were very careful with the Scottish devolution legislation to make sure that issues of abortion could not come under the purview of the Edinburgh Parliament, because that would create issues. We have not had the David Steele Abortion Act in Northern Ireland. We operate under common law. The doctors keep getting worried about that and asking for us to legislate to it, but I think the doctors are out of their minds by calling for legislation. Once you start legislation on that, then the religious sectarian issues will come right to the forefront and cause enormous difficulties, whereas the common law provision, in many respects, is even more generous than David Steele's bill. It only takes one doctor, common law, to be of the view that it's necessary for the health of the mother, and health, as defined at common law, includes mental health. So you're actually getting very, very close to what the situation is, but it's just not in law. And as I say, the doctors get worried and they keep raising issues. And we have had, just recently, a very bad case, which I think may drive us into some bad laws, poor law as a result of it. The thing I'm going to conclude with, because I think I'm pretty well up to time on that, is that there was in recent times just one major provision with regard to this in terms of policy. It was a programme called Education for Mutual Understanding. It laid on every school, primary and secondary, an obligation to have an EMU programme, and the programme basically was one obliging them to create events and activities that would bring the pupils of that school into contact with the other pupils of other schools. And whether that has made any great difference to popular attitudes, I very much doubt. People keep talking about, integrated housing and integrated schools as being things that would contribute. Well, middle-class housing has always been integrated. And middle class, of course, are very polite and don't publicly give vent to the views on this. But if you look closely enough at voting patterns, you can see that the middle class are just as strongly about issues as working class do. And with regard to schools, well, the EMU programme runs well in some areas, not well in other areas. And the areas where it runs not well is the areas where it's needed, and the area where it runs well is the areas where it's not needed. But that's not going to change quickly in any respect. And for those who think that integrated education will make a difference, there was a marvellous integrated educational system introduced in the Victorian times called the national schools. And if you look at the terms under which they operated, wholly admirable. But the national schools have all disappeared, been replaced by the present rather very strongly communal schools, which now operates, which requires this EMU programme to mitigate the negative consequences of them, but it doesn't really matter much. I know my last point I'll add also with regard to integrating schools. In 1920, the first Ulster Unionist government in Northern Ireland, its very first, within the first 5 bills it presented to Parliament was legislation for a single compulsorily integrated educational system.
Yeah.
Right? It didn't go anywhere. All the churches were against, and it was causing too much difficulties, so it was dropped. It could not be brought back together again because the European Convention on Human Rights would prevent you having a compulsorily integrated educational system. Maybe this is another good reason for leaving the European Convention.
Oh. 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 Your final throwaway remark with this controversy.